So let's get started stitching some lines. These 3 lines, when we combine them together, create a zigzag design. And I want you to pay attention to the techniques that we're using for this simple design. It's a simple design, but it offers some techniques that you will use over and over again. Let's go to the overhead camera. These are the 3 lines that we're going to stitch ruler quilt stitch with our straight edge ruler. Now, you should have marked on your quilt sandwich a 5-inch square. Once you mark a 5-inch square, you're going to mark a line on the sandwich, the distance halfway from each corner, which means 2.5 inches. Here's our square. And you're going to mark here in the middle, in between the 2 corners. Then we have 2 corners here, and this is the middle. And then this is the middle. Just imagine that this is in a square. You'll understand more once I show you the demonstration, but this is your end result. When we combined these 3 lines and alternate their direction, we create a zigzag. Let's look at how this is stitched on the machine. I'm using a BERNINA 79. Let's take a look. So here's the BERNINA 79. My machine is all set up. My needle is in that first top middle line that I marked on my sandwich. I have a 5-inch square. I've marked half the distance, 2.5 inches, every single side of the 5-inch square. So you see it in 2 places. First, stitch from one midpoint to the opposite midpoint. The second thing you'll do is stitch from one corner to the opposite corner, making 2 parallel lines. Then you'll make a third parallel lines. All of these parallel lines are diagonal in relation to the marked square on your quilt sandwich. Let's take a look at how this is stitched. I'll start the video. So right now I'm using what is called a measuring gauge or a spacing gauge. The spacing gauge has a 1/4-inch arm that mimics the distance of how far the needle is stitching from the ruler. So that helps me position the ruler in the right location. Then I'm going to stop on that reference line I marked on my sandwich. That's 2.5 inches from both sides or each corner. Now I'm going to break the thread and I'm finished. One straight line. Because we're only doing one square, we're going to do that for each of the 3 lines. We're going to put our needle down, needle up in the corner, pull up the bobbin thread, then put the needle back down and slightly pull on both of those threads to reduce any slack in the thread. Now we bring in the ruler right next to the foot. Make sure that that ruler is having contact with the foot. Now I'm going to take the spacing gauge and we're going to talk about that. So don't worry. I just want you to watch this. You're going to watch first, then you're going to stitch it out yourself. So I'm putting light pressure down on the quilt sandwich and light pressure toward the foot. Let me stop the video right here. That is the 1/4-inch arm on the spacing gauge. I'm going to put the spacing gauge on the edge of the ruler. I'm mimicking the position of the needle. Remember, when the needle's in the center of the ruler foot, it's stitching a 1/4 inch away when that ruler foot is making contact with the ruler. So I can take the spacing gauge, put it right next to the ruler, and it will help me determine where the needle is going to stop when the ruler is placed And I want to place the ruler at the right position so that it stops in the corner of the square. And that's what I'm checking. Let's resume the video. So I'm putting that edge of the spacing gauge to make sure it stops. The needle, when I continue to stitch, the needle will stop exactly in the corner. This takes a little practice, so don't worry. You will get better every single time you use it. So here I go again. I'm going to break thread, and yes, you'll have to knot and bury the threads, or you can stitch 2 or 3 stitches in place and break the thread. It's your choice. The third line is midpoint to midpoint. Remember what I said, we're stitching 3 separate lines. Each of them are parallel. The first line was midpoint to midpoint at the top of the screen. The second one was corner to corner. And the third, again, is midpoint, meaning the middle of the square to the opposite side, middle of the opposite side. Midpoint to midpoint. So let's watch this. It's a repeat. So if you practice this technique, needle down, needle up to bring the bobbin thread to the top. You always want to bring that up to the top. Then put the needle down in that position. So you see, I didn't get it at the right spot. So I'm trying it multiple times. So I wanted to show you this in the video so that you know that sometimes I don't hit it in the right spot. And that's okay. So you just start over. I want it to be right there where the side of the of the square that we marked and the tick line that is the 2.5 inch distance, that crosshair, that's where I want the needle to start. I'm going to use the 1/4 inch arm again on the measuring gauge or spacing gauge to make sure the needle stops at the crosshair between the outer part of the box and the 2.5 inch line that I marked. It's always good to double and triple check to make sure the ruler's in the right position. And then I stop right there on the line. Now this is just a practice piece. This is a way to help you get comfortable using the spacing gauge or the measuring gauge, how to start and stop in a specific location. Now, when we are stitching the zigzag design, we're not going to have that many starts and stops. We're going to have multiple blocks right next to each other. And we're going to stitch from midpoint to midpoint. And then we're going to stitch from corner to corner to corner, going up and down across the quilt. That is how we make the design. Let me show you what that can look like when we do it multiple times. Let's take a look. Here's an example of when we take those 3 lines and we stitch them continuously across the surface of a quilt instead of one quilt block or square in our example. We're stitching from corner to corner. Can you see how from corner to corner we have a zigzag design? When we stitch, if you look at the left-hand side of this video, the first line is midpoint to midpoint. The second line is corner to corner, and the third is midpoint to midpoint. When we're stitching across a quilt, one row at a time, corner to corner, we're going to do 1 row. When we stitch midpoint to midpoint, we're stitching the top row and the second row of blocks at the same time. A beautiful zigzag design, easily stitched from one corner to the next, from one midpoint to the next. This is the first technique that you've learned for the ruler quilting challenge.